Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We hear about cyber attacks every day in the media. We hear how credit card details, data is being stolen from retailers. We hear how usernames and passwords are stolen from online web services. We hear about databases of personal sensitive details being stolen, being hacked. All criminal, all financially motivated. Now, in contrast to criminal attacks, we hear far less about cyber espionage attacks, attacks that are designed to damage national security. There's a few reasons for this. These attacks don't happen at the same scale or on the same frequency. The impact of the attacks isn't immediately clear. And many of the attacks go undetected or undisclosed, and we never find out about them. But be under no illusion that no reports of activity is not the same thing as no activity at all. Nation-state attackers are carefully, deliberately, stealthily attacking entities all over the globe, stealing data that gives them an advantage, whether that's political, economic, commercial, or military. Now, cyber attacks are low risk, low cost, and can bring huge benefits for the attacker. And even a lightly resourced attacker can attack networks on the other side of the world and cause significant damage to national security. And the situation appears to be getting worse. To discuss all of this and more, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the industry's foremost experts, James Trainor. James serves as Senior Vice President of Aon Cyber Solutions and joined Aon after a distinguished 20-year career at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In his last role as Assistant Director of the Cyber Division in Washington, D.C., James led a team that implemented and developed the FBI's national strategy to combat cybercrime. James, thanks for agreeing to share your expertise. Perhaps I could start by asking you to talk a little bit about your time at the FBI and in particular experiences fighting nation-state hackers.
Thanks, Rob. Great opportunity to be here and talk about this issue with folks. My career in the Bureau actually went by pretty quick, 20 years of service, and I reached the two magic numbers, 20 years of service, age 50, and you can retire. And the last 3 years was responsible for leading the FBI's cyber team, which is over 1,000 people or so that are working on computer intrusion cases. So the types of, there's a lot of internet crime perpetrated online, but the types of work that my team was responsible for, both in Washington, D.C., and the 56 field offices, was really about computer intrusions, hacking, malware, data destruction, data theft. And a sizable portion of those cases were crimes perpetrated by nation-state actors, whether that's for the theft of trade secrets, intellectual property, classified information, influencing the democratic process, things of that nature. Certainly it was an eye-opening experience, particularly in the time that I was there from 2013 to 2016.
And so looking back over the last 15 years, which I guess is the time that nation-state hacking has really boomed. It's been around longer than that, but in the public consciousness for perhaps the last 15 years, how have cyber attacks grown in scale and sophistication, and to what extent do they threaten national security?
So the FBI's cyber division was established in 2002, and the first, I would say probably 10 years or so, we focused mostly on internet-enabled crime and crimes against children and things of that nature. And then with an initiative called Next Gen Cyber, which has really happened in 2012, my division was really responsible and kind of transferred over to really focusing on these complex computer intrusion cases. So this activity was certainly going on well before 2012, but it was at that period of time when the Bureau recognized that we needed a dedicated workforce to focus on those particular issues. And generally speaking, 2/3 of the cases are going to be involving criminal actors, and 1/3 or so will be involved nation-state actors. It's just not that there's, it's not necessarily rhyme or reason for why that's the percentage. It's just I think there's probably a lot more criminal actors out there than there are nation-states perpetrating this activity. But there's activity on both sides.
And how has the scale of attacks and the number of attackers changed over the years?
They've certainly become more sophisticated. So the tradecraft, both on and off a network, has certainly evolved in the last couple of years, for sure. The ability to maintain anonymity, the prevalence certainly of virtual currencies from a criminal perspective allows a bad actor to be, maintain anonymity. More and more people are involved in this. There's certainly cybercrime as a service. You can go online in the dark forums and purchase infrastructure or tools for perpetrating these crimes. So, ransomware is a perfect example of kind of how the threat evolved from going after individuals and paying the ransom via PayPal or credit card to now where the entire transaction is done online via Tor and paying through a cryptocurrency. So the threat will always evolve and the tradecraft continues to improve.
When we're thinking about nation states, which states in particular are you most concerned about, and how many states have an offensive capability?
So from a U.S. perspective, regarding nation-state actors, it's really the four principal actors. It's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They all vary in terms of volume, the number of people that are engaged in it, whether they collaborate with criminal actors to perpetrate that crime, the targets that they go after, the tradecraft both on and off the network, the malware that they use, how they escalate privileges on a network. All of these types of things vary to some degree. So if you look at that cyber kill chain that Lockheed Martin talks about, there's various ways to run those plays. And, we've become pretty capable, the U.S. government has been pretty capable of figuring out who's running these plays against U.S. entities over time.
And does it change much, the targeting of the U.S. against other Western nations? Are all the Western democracies facing the same threat?
Certainly. I think the way the way the U.S. government, obviously not speaking for them, the way we kind of view this is that it's understood and recognized that nation states can conduct offensive cyber operations or SIGINT collection for purposes of defending national security. What's not acceptable is conducting that activity where you're stealing intellectual property or trade secrets from a company and then sharing it with their competitors to provide a competitive advantage. That's kind of a position that certainly President Obama's administration, and I'm fairly confident the current administration views it as well. Regardless, they're both criminal activity, and what we've seen really since 2014 is a series of indictments and arrests on nation-state actors from China, Russia, and Iran. There were indictments in Iran in 2016, and then the recent indictments of one of the North Korean actors on Sony. So there will be a variety of responses, but that's kind of the way the U.S. government's position is how they view the differences.
And I want to come back and talk responses a little more later on. Are there standout incidents that have changed the way that the cyber threat has been viewed in the US?
Yeah, there were during my tenure, there was really three principal intrusions that were very significant. The first being Sony, which happened in November of 2014. Sony was making a movie called The Interview, and North Korea obviously attacked it, a destructive attack, did harassment. All things a company could see in a computer intrusion. Sony saw that, and my team was heavily involved in that matter. And I can't speak enough about the collaboration that we had with private industry, the victim, in this case Sony, and the U.S. intelligence community to work that event very quickly, which led to an indictment, this past month. So Sony's a big one, and it's also that was an attack on the kind of on a fundamental constitutional principle, your First Amendment, the right of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So that was a significant one. The OPM intrusion, 21.5 million records that were compromised during that breach. That happened in 2015.
And just for our non-US guests, can you explain OPM?
Sure. So OPM stands for the Office of Personnel Management, which is essentially kind of the U.S. government's human resources department, and with that are a collection of personnel records for millions of people. And during that intrusion, those records were stolen, and the practices that OPM employed to protect that data was not great. They've subsequently invested millions of dollars to protect that data, but that was a significant event that could lead to catastrophic counterintelligence issues for many years. And then the third is pretty obvious, is the DNC and DCCC, the Democratic National Committee, and the other committee, DCCC. They're trying to shape and influence the U.S. democratic process. So those are three significant ones just over the last few years that are really problematic. Is it's not just about monetizing the data; it's more about shaping and impacting the whole society in the U.S.
I want to do a quick reminder at this point that you can submit your questions to James through the Web Summit app. To do this, go to the app, click on your profile settings, scroll down to questions and polls, click on forum rostra, submit your question there. We'll have a few minutes at the end to go through them. We'll put James on the spot at the end. How do Russian and Chinese attacks differ in methodology? Are they quite discrete, or are they trying to do the same things? Is there a difference in the risk that the attackers are willing to take?
Yeah, so, Russian activity, I would put, from a nation-state perspective, there's three, intelligence organizations that are heavily involved in activity. You'll see more collaboration between the intel agencies and criminal actors. Their tradecraft is very advanced, very sophisticated, certainly have a process of going through how they approach a target. Less involved in economic espionage and more involved in the straight-up kind of influence operations. And they'll obviously supplement computer intrusion activity with some of the things we've seen on social media platforms to influence the process. So it's more kind of comprehensive in scope. China, it's principally the PLA that's heavily involved in that space, less collaboration with criminal actors, heavily focus on intellectual property, gathering information that could target, that could help their economy in more numbers, more volumes of people that have this skill set and ability to do that, and much more also, much more open economy. So you'll get China, Russia, and obviously there's been heavily sanctioned country, where less so in China. So you have the ability to there's more opportunities for them, to target the U.S.
Now, I guess China and Russia are big players on the world stage, maybe politically less ready to take huge risks on attacking companies and democracies that could really have a negative impact on their standing on the world stage. Do you think in that respect, Iran and North Korea have got less to lose, are more dangerous threat actors?
They're certainly more brazen. I do not believe that they have the same skill set or capability that Russia or China has, primarily because of the sanctions that have been imposed on them. But they've been able to, regardless of that, been able to be effective. With Iran conducting the Saudi Aramco attack, as well as the DDoS attacks of several U.S. banks going back to 2011, 2012. So Iran has been very aggressive. North Korea has certainly built a capability. The South Korean banks, Sony, Bank of Bangladesh, and all these other events that they've gone after, cryptocurrency exchanges. So definitely more brazen. Both have also done destructive attacks, where we really haven't seen that between Russia and, well, I shouldn't say that. We have seen it with Russia, with Ukrainian power plant, but they're less likely to do these type of attacks, where Iran and North Korea certainly have demonstrated the capability and interest in doing that if they can.
Now, you talked about some of the attacks. I don't think the Sony attack was immediately attributed to North Korea. OPM attack wasn't immediately attributed to China. How difficult is it to attribute attacks, and is there a benefit to pointing the finger at an attacker?
Yeah, well, I know there was some discussions after the Sony event that it wasn't North Korea, it was some other people. I can tell you that's completely false. I speak with absolute certainty that North Korea was responsible for that intrusion, and they probably knew it within, a few days of the event. And that's from a U.S. government's position. I will say that whether the U.S. government decides to make public attribution, there are obviously national security implications to that. And in the case of the Sony intrusion, it made sense from a national security perspective, political perspective, to provide public attribution. But in other cases, it may not make sense. Public attribution very well could take the form of an indictment or an arrest, or no notification, and allow the U.S. government and our foreign partners to proceed with ongoing investigations. Attribution. The way we approach attribution, it's not just about the technical information you get from computer intrusions. It's all sources, whether that's human, SIGINT, partnerships, third-party cybersecurity vendors. It's a puzzle that you're putting together, And in many respects, you already have pieces to the puzzle before the event even happens on these actors. So it can be hard, but I think we've gotten, as an organization, we've gotten much better at doing that. And there's obviously a lot of cybersecurity firms out there that have good intel and can do attribution as well.
When a private company is attacked and do their own investigation, is it ever worth them trying to attribute the attack? Is there any sort of benefit for them, reputational-wise, to say we were attacked by a state actor, there was nothing we could do?
It may help in the litigation or regulatory enforcement that you had a kind of an advanced adversary that, regardless of the controls that you put in place, that you would be positioned to protect the data. But I don't think it's in the best interest for companies to provide public attribution. It's certainly alerting to the adversary that you're aware that they're responsible for it, and it could obviously cause implications on law enforcement, but it also could lead to retaliation. I'm not sure there's necessarily, what's the upside of this. It's, it's really about remediating the event as quickly as possible, implementing new controls, protecting your customers and your employees, and providing the appropriate regulatory notification as required.
So even thinking back sort of 10 years ago, the vast majority of knowledge about cyber attackers and the attacks themselves was all closed in government hands. That knowledge was very confined to government. And then this industry sprang up with instant response companies and cybersecurity software companies that gave an extra level of insight into what was going on. How has that changed our understanding of the level of activity out there and what threat actors are doing?
Yeah, there's, it's kind of created this opportunity for threat intelligence companies. So there's, probably half a dozen that I'm, familiar with and have worked with in various capacities. And they have some good intel, good insight on things. I do think that, one of the things that I look often at is the creation of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is in the United States. It's a non-profit organization that work collaboratively to share indicators of compromise, technical data across vendors. So Palo Alto Networks is one, Cisco is a partner, Symantec and other companies. They're sharing the intelligence that they collect off of their infrastructure with each other. And the idea is to create a playbook of understanding of how these actors perform their activity. So what you'll start to see in that space will be information sharing about who the adversaries are, their campaigns, the techniques, and the technical indicators of how they perform their activity. So it's become more comprehensive, a better understanding. The good SOCs, good cybersecurity teams, manage adversaries rather than managing incidents. So it's knowing who's attacking your environment, what kind of risk you have, and then being able to address that proactively rather than just kind of playing whack-a-mole with all the incidents that may happen.
Now we know that the attackers are constantly evolving. They're finding new techniques to break into networks. Is our critical national infrastructure and our government departments, are they able to improve their defenses rapidly enough to keep pace with the attackers?
No, I mean, there's certainly been an effort. Department of Homeland Security is really the principal department that's responsible for protecting U.S. infrastructure, critical infrastructure. Obviously the Department of Energy and Transportation and others are involved in that. But, the adversary is always going to have a kind of a step up. It's very expensive to protect that infrastructure, and the attacks are, becoming more and more automated. So it's going to become more challenging over the next few years for sure. But I am hopeful that, particularly in the cybersecurity industry, as it matures, and you see consolidation and more machine learning, more AI to help remediate these events, that things will be better down the road. But in the short term, the next 3 to 5 years, it could be pretty messy.
So you touched earlier a little on the 2016 presidential election and the cyber influence campaigns that took place there. Yesterday with the US midterms, do you think we're going to see that Russians and or other nations were involved in trying to influence votes?
Yeah, I can't speak to the election that happened yesterday, but I think the influence of elections, whether that's through computer intrusions or through a campaign via social media, is here to stay. I don't envision that ever ever going away. It's an unfortunate kind of situation, but I think the more we can educate the public about it, the more we can protect the infrastructure, the more private industry can take down that infrastructure that's clearly with malicious intent that can be challenging is really the kind of where I'm focusing my attention. And I've kind of accepted the reality of that kind of activity going on.
Is there a degree of cyber espionage activity that states are willing to tolerate?
Yeah, so I look at the event in the Ukraine on December 23rd, 2015, with the attack on that power plant, where it impacted about 250,000 customers, particularly in December in Ukraine. So those attacks, destructive attacks, targeting the energy sector, infrastructure, in my mind, is completely inappropriate because it impacts every industry, impacts every hospital, every school, every business. And that's just an area which it should be off limits. I also thought that some of the attacks that I've seen on schools and hospitals also just seem to be totally inappropriate. And mostly you'll see that more on you'll see that in nation states on universities, but on the hospitals you tend to see it from criminal actors. And it would seem to me that everybody has hospitals, every country has hospitals and schools. It would seem to be should be somewhat of a safe zone where should be a cyber norm not to attack those three areas in my mind.
So if states cross these red lines and attacks on the voting process for an election, for schools or hospitals, what response options are open to a state to retaliate, to send a message that that's not acceptable?
Yeah, so there's a lot of responses that you can do, and certainly there's you can do nothing. You can certainly provide economic sanctions onto those entities, which tends to be the one that we historically have done. You can also do indictments. You can do arrests. You can do cyber offensive operations. You could do other military action, even if it's a kind of a destructive attack that leads to the loss of life. So it's really all options are kind of on the table. It's just what makes sense. What the investigators have? What are the political or national security consequences? Also, you don't want to necessarily make things worse. From creating more incentive to attack the U.S. That's why I'm not a big fan. I'm not a fan at all of hackback by U.S. companies responding. I think it's not in the realm of an option, primarily because one of the questions you asked earlier about attribution, in which attribution can be challenging, and you very well could be hacking back somebody who's a victim and their infrastructure is just simply being used in an attack. So all options are on the table, and it becomes a challenge in figuring out what kind of consequences should you levy on a nation state for their activity, and I think that's still being kind of sorted out in the U.S.
So I want to ask one last quick question before we go to some of the audience questions. What role does insurance play in corporate cyber risk management?
So cyber insurance, so I work for Aon, which is a large risk advisory firm, and we place about 3.5, I should say the market places about $3.5 billion annually in premiums, and we're about probably 20% of that market. So there's a significant growth opportunity for cyber insurance, and it really uncovers three areas. It's breach response, liability, and then business interruption. So if you suffer a cyber event and your business is interrupted, there's obviously going to be financial losses attributed to that. And that's really the area that's most innovative in the space. How broad can my business interruption coverage occur? But from our perspective is you don't want the event to happen, so you want to have all these cybersecurity things in place. But when those things do fail, and they inherently do, it's technology, then you have a risk transfer solution in place to provide balance sheet protection, and you don't suffer significant financial consequences from the event.
So we've got time for probably two quick audience questions. Who are the biggest cybercrime networks that are using cyber attacks? Any known? I mean, do the mafia, have they switched from traditional forms of organized crime to cyber yet?
Yeah, so the cybercrime networks, it's really about the forums. So the administrators of these forums, and the three big ones that that have been taken down: a Silk Road, Hansa Market, and Alphabay. These are three big forums, marketplaces, in which cyber criminals can go and sell and buy their services, whether you're a botnet herder, bulletproof hoster, malware checker, whatever. So those are the forums, and it's, view it as more kind of collaborative in nature, that you can go there and find the capabilities. The most prolific hacker is a guy that we indicted in 2014, named Yevgeny Bogachev. He's a Russian hacker. He's responsible for Game Over Zeus. He was responsible for CryptoLocker, which is an early variant of ransomware. There's a $3 million reward. So if I had to put it on one individual, I'd probably put Yevgeny Bogachev as the principal cyber criminal hacker.
And second question here, the role of social engineering in cyber espionage. So we have all of these fantastically complicated ways to attack networks and data. Is the human still the weakest link? Is that the one that the attackers are going for most often?
Sure, that's why you're going to use the means that work, and it's the least intrusive means to get into a network. So spear phishing email, whether it contains a malicious attachment or a malicious link, is always, generally is going to continue to be the manner in which one would get into a network, because it works, and it's not necessarily alerting, and you don't have to use your more advanced tools or 0 days that you've identified. So social engineering is here to stay, and the human, educating your workforce is clearly very, very important. You'll also see it. Another aspect of this is more internet-enabled crime, is this issue of business email compromise. That's $1 billion business where you're fooling executives to wire transfer funds out in an unauthorized way, because they were able to get themselves interjected into these financial processes that companies have. So it'll always be there. I'm hopeful that technology will improve some of that over time, but in the short time, the social engineering attacks and there's a way to mitigate that. There's a way to ensure that as well. Is here to stay also.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the top of the hour, so can I ask you please to thank James for his time and his insight today?